This is the iPhone 2G. This is Apple's first iPhone ever released. This thing came out back in 2007, and this phone competed against phones like the Samsung Blackjack, the BlackBerry 8800, and the Palm Trio 700p. This phone was really a phone of its era. This was a really high-end phone for the time, and I'll get more into pricing later. The first thing that anyone who picks up a 2G might notice is just the very premium design. This thing was just the best designed phone at the time. Most phones of this time had a cheap plastic build, or even sometimes a more high-end but still kind of cheap plastic and metal build. This phone had a glass display, which, as you can see on all three of my 2Gs, has unfortunately cracked over time, and this phone had a really nice stainless steel ring around the screen, and on the back it's just made of this nice aluminum. Now, another unfortunate part about this, the antennas do tend to fall off in these phones easily. Unfortunately, two of these 2Gs have had the antennas pop off, but this 2G right here does have the antenna still. Overall, this phone was designed amazingly. These edges are just super smooth, they're nice and rounded out, and the buttons feel great. This phone just felt very nice to use in the hand. And comparing this to some BlackBerry phones, this thing just looks and feels great. It even had this nice mute switch. This was kind of normal on phones at the time. Was this phone innovative though? That's one of the questions I have. So this was the first phone, to my knowledge, to feature a multi-touch display. Pretty much what this means, this phone can use two fingers at once to pretty much scroll or zoom in, anything like that. And this really helped while zooming into something like Safari, of course is not going to work right now, or zooming into a photo, and the multi-touch display is still being used to this day on modern iPhones. This had no stylus, which was something that a lot of phones at the time needed for the display to work. There was no need for a stylus, and Steve Jobs famously said there was no need for a stylus on this phone because a stylus just complicated things. You'd lose it, everything. Steve Jobs was entirely correct about that. There was no need for a stylus, and this phone works so much better without a stylus than with a stylus. Another thing that this phone did amazingly was the iOS operating system. This phone featured iOS 1.0 when it came out, or at the time categorized as iPhone OS. It was upgradable all the way to iOS 3.1.3 or iPhone OS, whatever you want to call it, and it was actually really smooth. Even though iOS 3 kind of did slow it down a little bit, this phone is still much smoother than any BlackBerry or Samsung phone from its time would be. And using this phone even in 2024, it feels smooth when you're not on the internet, of course. Just going through generally, apps on this phone, it feels nice. It was not exactly the most underpowered phone, but it wasn't the most powerful phone, if that makes sense. This phone, of course, had the sleek aluminum and glass design like I talked about before, something unheard of at the time. And another thing that not a lot of people mention about this phone, this thing interfaced with iTunes and the iPod OS and the iPod features very well. So I can go into the iPod app here, and I can pretty much get anything that I would be able to do on an iPod from the time. This phone was really good at doing stuff like that. I'm able to pretty much do anything I want with the music app, and I can even load on movies and stuff onto this phone with no issues. This even came preloaded with a YouTube app, which worked perfectly back in the day, but now, unfortunately, it does not work anymore. And this thing had a very large, for the time, 3.5-inch display. Of course, comparing this to anything even relatively modern, it's definitely a tiny screen by today's standard, but for the time, this was when phones rarely had a display larger than a small square. So this was a really big innovation for the time, just this entire display system. This phone did have its cons though, and Apple haters at the time would be sure to point all of those out. So first, this phone only supported 2G. This phone was not officially released under the name of iPhone 2G, but it was pretty much called the 2G because that's what it was. It was the 2G version of the iPhone, and this was a big issue at the time because 2G was notoriously slow, and 3G was something that general user really would like to have on the phone. That didn't come for about another year though. This phone had a very high price point. For a 4GB phone, this costed $499. That is a lot of money, especially at the time, and that was signing a contract with AT&T, being stuck on their service for a good 2 years. For the 8GB version, which is what most people ended up choosing, it was an extra $100 at $599. The price tag was what a lot of people thought would do this phone in, but fortunately, the price tag never really affected this phone. People bought it anyway. It didn't sell amazingly, but it still sold pretty well with its price tag. And another con is that this thing was only available on AT&T. Let's say your area didn't have AT&T coverage. This thing only came on AT&T. Couldn't get it on Verizon, couldn't get it on any smaller carriers, and this was around the time when Singular was transitioning into AT&T, so a lot of people didn't really trust AT&T at the time. And another thing is, this thing lacked features like copy and paste in some email provider supports up until, I believe, iPhone OS 2.0 and 3.0 came out to try and mitigate some of those issues. This was a pretty big issue for most people at the time, as it wasn't exactly great for people who used these phones for businesses. And I can understand that. Not having copy-paste on a phone would kind of annoy me, but this phone just didn't support it when BlackBerry's did, and Microsoft Exchange support was a pretty big thing for some business clients as well. The App Store, which everybody knows and loves today, or at least a lot of people do, this did not exist when this phone came out. This was a feature reserved for iPhone OS 2.0. Steve Jobs didn't really want to put an app store on this phone. He believed that web apps would go a far way in this phone's success, but he was incorrect on that. Web apps never really did get too far. As we know today, apps were the good call, and whoever at Apple decided that the App Store was a good idea was correct. What did the iPhone 2G mean? Just in general. The iPhone 2G really started a trend of more premium design on phones, and with touchscreens becoming more common, this started the app trend in modern pop culture. A lot of people could recognize this phone from a distance just because of the new iPhones, because iPhones looked the same all the way up until the iPhone 10 when they got rid of this front design with the home button at the bottom and the earpiece speaker at the top. This is an iPhone 7 Plus, and you can definitely tell these came from the same company. There's a big size difference, but still, same general design. And iPhones just became this really big pop culture thing. Even to this day, iPhones are a big part of pop culture. And honestly, later generations of the iPhone helped introduce things that are now just normal in everyday life, such as music streaming, quick and easy video calling, and even mobile photography. These phones really did shape the future entirely, not just with mobile technology, but in the world. Because think of what the world would be without stuff like Zoom and music streaming, Netflix, just video streaming in general. That probably wouldn't have existed without this phone. So even though this phone, in my opinion, is one of Apple's greatest innovations, a lot of people, back in 2007, thought that this phone was nothing more than a gimmick. And I think that after Microsoft realized that this phone was not a gimmick, they got kind of scared. And this kind of dug Windows Mobile into the ground. So, thanks to the iPhone 2G for pretty much giving everyone everything about the iPhone. With that said, if you enjoyed this video, like would be appreciated. If you want to see content like this, you can subscribe, and goodbye. And just to note, I've had all of these iPhone 2Gs for a while. I got this 4GB one back in July of 2021. I got this 8GB one in sometime in like 2022, and I got this 8GB one in January of 2020. I believe this one has been shown in a good few of my videos. Just a note, because some people like to ask me where I get my phones from. Goodbye.